Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about Unit 3, the first part of Unit 3, and that has to do with consciousness. Most people consider consciousness to be pretty tricky. So if I asked you right now, are you consciously aware? You'd probably say, oh yes, do as I'm aware of the fact that I'm watching a video, I'm taking notes, which if you are taking notes, you should remember to pause the video while you're doing that to be sure you take notes effectively. But if I asked you in a few hours here to consider when you are asleep, would you consider that to be consciousness? We'll talk about this pretty well in class, but most psychologists would say that you are still actually conscious. You are still aware of your environment, just not at the same level that you would be if you were wide awake. So let's check this out. First, what is consciousness? You are aware of you, right? That's kind of a tricky issue here, but we have a special thing with human beings, the way we are and the way we think, the way our brain works at a high level. We're not only aware of us, we're aware of others. We're aware that we can have thoughts about others, independent of what we're saying or doing. And we're aware that others can have thoughts of us that are independent of what they're saying and doing. That we're aware that they are aware of us. See? That's the thing there, isn't it? That's consciousness. And your individual awareness of your unique thoughts and memories, feelings and sensations and environment are all what make consciousness important. Your conscious experiences are constantly shifting and changing. Just sitting here right now, if I was very concentrated on what I was doing, I would not have heard the AC just kick on right there. But it did, and it grabbed hold of my conscious thought. Those are the kinds of things that are constantly being adjusted as you're going throughout your day. I think we'll discuss in class how you're discussing or lecturing. We're talking a little bit about this topic of consciousness, and I will say, are you truly aware of this room and what's in it and what's around you? And if you just look around at the walls and ceilings and think about what you're seeing, pretty much none of you were able to say that you were completely aware of what was happening in the room. And one of the things that you probably weren't quite keenly aware of was the sound of the fans and the projector, which we're totally used to. We flip the projector on. You may hear it initially, but when that projector is circulating air through it, it's kind of a constant noise, and it gets to a certain point where we're not really thinking about it because it's not different. It hasn't changed. This is much like what we talked about with sensation and perception. But consciousness is what you're experiencing and considering. That might be another way of thinking of it. So in one moment you could be focused on these notes, and your consciousness may shift to the memory of a conversation you had with a buddy today at school, or at lunch, or between classes. The next moment you might notice how uncomfortable your chair is, or maybe you're daydreaming about dinner. Or I may all of a sudden start to realize how much my feet hurt even sitting here, but that's another story. This ever-shifting stream of thoughts, called a stream of consciousness, can change dramatically from one moment to the next, but your experience of it seems rather smooth and effortless, and that's the amazing part of the human brain. All of those neurons working together to give us this sense that it's normal. And I think a lot of times that's strange if you think about it, how amazing it is. Thanks to technology, consciousness is making a scientific comeback, and it really is, because we're able to look into the brain, and with brain imaging and some of the amazing things happening with MRIs, we're able to really see blood flow with the fMRI, like we've talked about before, blood flow in the brain, to see what active portions of the brain are actually doing. But early psychologists and someone who, as we've discussed before, is a freaking genius, William James, very interested in consciousness, and he wanted to study its function, how it operated. He kind of coined this term and came up with this thought process of stream of consciousness. He also had some incredible quotes. He really did. The greatest weapon against stress is our ability to choose one thought over another. In a way, that's very, very deep thought, isn't it? But it's also, what are you consciously choosing to be aware of? If there's something that's stressing you out, if you chose not to be aware of it and focused your concentration and your consciousness somewhere else, then it might not be such a bad thing. So, how would you study or look at the function of consciousness? That's pretty difficult to do, isn't it? Today, thanks to all these new imaging tools, we have a chance to do that. And there's another area of science and psychology that's growing called cognitive psychology. That's the study of the brain like it's a computer, as we have mentioned a few times before, especially Unit 1, we look at all the areas. So think back on Unit 2, where we talked about dualism. Monism and dualism, this idea of, is the brain and the mind separate from the body, or is it just one thing? As someone coined the term, a bag of neurons. This is pretty deep philosophical thought, but scientifically, we might be able to prove it one way or another. Dualists think that thought, and a dualist believes that there's a mind and a spirit separate from the body. But they believe that humans have free will, that consciousness is external, that it continues even after the body is dead. Your consciousness or your soul, your spirit continues to live. But monists think that the body dies and the brain dies, and so does consciousness. It's all kind of one energy system, and when that's no longer functioning, it's over. That type of mindset typically would say you also do not have free will, that you don't choose your own path and do your own thing. There are an endless bits and bunches of things that may seem coincidental that steer you into the direction you've chosen to take or the behavior you've exhibited. I'm not saying either one of those is correct, but I am saying these are the ways that people look at the world, and how we view consciousness is kind of steered through that. Levels of consciousness, we've already discussed this with anybody? Do you remember who talked about the iceberg? Freud, of course. And Freud kind of makes a little bit of a comeback here, backed by, interestingly enough, a little bit of science. If you can study the brain in a really deep way with this new imaging technology, maybe you can get to the bottom of where the unconscious mind really is. And that's what Freud was trying to tap into. Consciousness, our level of awareness about ourselves and the environment. That's the psychological textbook definition. But this definition implies that consciousness is not an on and off switch, that we're not conscious or unconscious. Does it say that? It does not. It says our levels of awareness about ourselves and our environment. So psychologists refer to different levels and states of consciousness. And it's ironic that we experience states of consciousness without being fully aware that we are experiencing them. And you would say, well, those are kind of unconscious things, aren't they? Well, let's look at the different levels. And not all researchers and scientists and psychologists agree to each of these levels, but here are some possible suggestions that most people do agree exist and they can see evidence of. The conscious level is what you're currently aware of, including yourself and your current environment. Okay, it's your consciousness. Non-conscious level would be your body processes controlled by your mind that are not usually or ever being aware of. Your heartbeat, your respiration, your digestion, all those autonomic processes in the body. The pre-conscious level is information about yourself and your environment that you are not currently thinking about, but you could be. It's pre-conscious, meaning, well, maybe I'm going to turn my attention and my conscious thought to it, and then it would switch from a pre-conscious level to a conscious one. You aren't currently thinking about your favorite toy as a child, but if you were asked about it, you would be. What was your favorite toy as a child? See, I just did that. I just did that right there. I don't know if you saw that. Subconscious level is information we are not currently aware of, but we know must exist due to behavior. Really good example is the mirror exposure effect. When we prefer a stimuli that we have seen before over a novel, new stimuli, even if we do not consciously remember seeing the old stimuli. The mirror exposure effect is sometimes shown by a reverse image or a mirror image of your own face. For example, if you looked into the mirror, the image of yourself being reflected from it is one you are comfortable with, and you would choose that image of you over one that was the viewpoint that another person would see. That is, unless you had a pretty symmetrical face where you didn't see much difference. But most of us, like my hair is parted from the right, and when it's parted from the right, if I look in the mirror, it looks like it's parted maybe from the opposite side, if you get the idea there. Some people tilt their head in a certain direction, and when they look in the mirror, they see it tilting in that direction, but other people see it tilting in the opposite direction because it's not the mirror image. So the mirror exposure effect would say that you would be more comfortable with that mirror image, but others look at you and they see you in the opposite way without the mirror image. So they'd be more comfortable with that viewpoint of you. So that's pretty interesting. The unconscious level is where psychoanalytic psychologists like Freud and Jung and some others have looked and believed that some events and feelings are unacceptable to our conscious mind and are repressed, like childhood or very early childhood. Many psychologists object to this concept as a difficult or very much impossible thing to prove. But will science allow us to maybe see some of this? We'll see. This isn't something you need to know for the test, but I did want to show you a little bit about the dualist model of perception. This is Max Velleman's reflexive monism. It's from the Journal of Consciousness and Consciousness Studies, 2008. I saw this online and I thought it was kind of an interesting way of looking at the world. You see the three different ways of viewing the world on the right panel there. And on the left-hand side, you'll see the dualist perspective here. The next one is a reductionist model, and the third is the reflexive model of perception. Now, we just got done talking about and learning about perception in the last chapter. It leads into consciousness pretty well. And in this first area here, the dualist perspective, you're seeing the cat as perceived by an external observer, E, not S, but as the person E. The percept of a cat in the mind of S is produced. But how are they getting that perception of a cat? Well, light rays are coming into the mind, which gives a neural representation of what a cat would look like in the brain. A neural cause and correlation of consciousness occurs, and that creates the thought bubble. That's the dualist perspective, that there's those two areas there in a way. A reductionist model says this: your eyes are pulling or seeing the light rays. The neural representation of a cat's produced. A conscious state or function of the brain is accessed. Okay, and then it is subjectively experienced as a perception of the cat, your perception of it, but this is nothing more than the conscious state or function of the brain. They're a reductionist, they're reducing it down to maybe a lot less than what a dualist would see. A reflexive model is this: the cat's perceived, the light rays are coming into the brain and through the eyes and the optic nerve. The neural causes and correlates of consciousness occur. The neural representation of a cat is shared in the brain. This produces an experience of a cat in the world as perceived by the subject. In some ways, this is also a viewpoint of if there was a trick where the light rays were coming in and you were perceiving that cat and producing it as an experience, that it may not be a cat. And I think coming off perception and sensation, I think we can all agree that there are some things that we see in the world that can trick us a little bit. And I think that's where they're going here with the reflexive model. This is not something I'm an expert in, but it's interesting to think about the kind of studies that they're doing, and this is a very recent one, on the models of perception and how it correlates to consciousness. This is a fascinating video by a person named David Eagleman, and we'll see him again in another part of class. He's squeezing his two fingers together like this, but he's talking about what is consciousness. He introduces you to what your future brain could be. Part of the conversation revolves around the fact that we do not perceive much of what the environment has to offer. Gamma rays, X-rays, all kinds of rays across the spectrum of light that we don't have any way of seeing. Another way of doing this would be if you're a parent, or if your parents were able to see the heat produced by your body, and they saw that as sort of a readout that your brain could perceive and understand, they'd be able to look at you and tell that you were sick, that you were running a fever. I don't know if you've ever had a protective mom come running over, checking your forehead. Oh, do you have a fever? Do you have a fever? She wouldn't even need to use that thermometer on you. She would just know. There might be ways with computer-assisted technology. Google Glass is a good example of that, where maybe we'll be able to use computers to give us a fuller understanding of the world around us. Night vision goggles is a good example of this. But what is our new brain going to have? Maybe we'll be able to do things because technology is assisting our brain that we could never fully have imagined doing before. And I'm recording a video right now and putting it on the internet here in a few minutes, and you're going to watch it all over the place, maybe. You could watch it from anywhere you have an internet connection and a YouTube account. That's not something I could have imagined doing when I was in high school. So, the world changes, and things do change. Let's talk about waking and sleeping rhythms. And we're going to get further into these two areas with sleep and dreams, the next two episodes here. Coffee. You can sleep when the grid is down, do stupid things faster with more energy. And I'm sorry I'm bugging you, but you know what they say, the early bird annoys the night owl. How many of you do feel like you're an early bird person? You wake up early, you get after it, and you don't have any problems like kind of getting up and going. You may have a brother, sister, mother, father, somebody in your house who is not a morning person, and they aren't able to get out of bed for a while, or that might be you. Everybody's a bit different. When you go to college, you can kind of pick which classes you want and when you want them, especially when you're an older student, juniors and senior upperclassmen, and it's always a good idea to maybe choose a class later in the morning if the morning isn't your best time, especially if it's a hard class. So consciousness, that annoying time between naps. That's what that cat's saying. When we are awake, we are in a state of consciousness. Everybody kind of realizes that. It's the active processing of information in your brain. It should be thought of really in a way that short-term memory and attention are combined. And we're going to talk about memory next after the learning chapter. Is the activity that's running through your minds or your heads at this time consciousness? According to the definition that we are awake, we are in a state of consciousness, we are actively processing, that answer is yes. We discussed already a stream of consciousness. That's all of those things mumbled together. You may hear somebody mention stream of consciousness because they're just talking about whatever, and then all of a sudden they realize what the date is. Oh, it's October 15th. Goodness, that's when Pearl Jam's new album comes out. And I don't know if you've seen the new video, but the lighting in that is amazing. And if I just went on a tangent here, is what some people call it, and go off and just start talking about the hockey game tonight, which none of you really care about, probably, that would be this stream of consciousness. And if you can, sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't, wrap it back to where we started, maybe it makes a little bit of sense. Stream of consciousness, though, isn't just that. in a comical sense. It's actually what is flowing through your brain during the time you're thinking and observing and actively processing. We can study this by looking at an EEG, which we have discussed before, and it's going to come in very handy here with dreams. So the great analogy again of conscious behavior, at least these 3 levels of consciousness. Conscious, which is that tip of the iceberg, it's above the water. Anybody can view it, even the Titanic could. But the subconscious is a pretty large area, but it's just below the surface. Can the subconscious sometimes kind of bob up above the iceberg, especially if it's some pretty big waves? Absolutely. And depending upon the temperature and the size of the iceberg, it's changing. And sometimes the subconscious is conscious. The unconscious, is pretty deep and vast and dark, and we'd be very uncertain about it. The Titanic, again, wouldn't know that the unconscious was there. It may think the iceberg is just yay big, but it's really as big as the screen, which wouldn't be that big for the Titanic, but you get the idea. So, daydreams and fantasies. Unfortunately, my daydreams about being skinny are always interrupted by the sound of my own chewing. That might fit me pretty well. Here's a good quote by Stephen Wright. I was trying to daydream, but my mind kept wandering. If you've never seen Stephen Wright, you might want to look him up on the YouTube after you've studied for the test. But he's a pretty good comic from the 80s and 90s. What are some common daydreams and fantasies? Well, you see the guy here down below. A lot of you will watch this for extra credit. It's a psychology movie that you could do for extra credit. It's called Juno. This person who was the actor in that, he may be looking across the street and he sees his neighbor, not the girl from Juno, but he sees the neighbor, and there she is in his daydream or his fantasy then above his head, which I'm showing you there. Maybe he is envisioning being with her at this party or at a dance, and they're there together. Yet you flash back to reality and you realize he's just eating a pastry with lots of wristbands and headbands on. So it's kind of a fantasy. Here's a different kind of fantasy. What do you think is happening in the top right-hand corner picture? This is pretty tricky. Pause it and think about it and consider what we're talking about here is fantasy and daydreaming and why we use it. And pause it and then come right back and I'll give you the answer. But I want you to think about what they might be doing here. Daydreams and dreaming can help us prepare for future events. They nourish our social development, and they substitute the daydreams do and the fantasies do for impulsive behavior. So that's the best way of looking at this picture to the top right. What's interesting is the person with the leather glove on who has her hand around her neck and she's got her bag. It definitely does look like what's happening here. She's come up behind someone who's just taken money out of an ATM machine. Looks like she's trying to rob her. The money's flying. In reality, what's happening here? Some of you have probably been able to determine what's happening. Either this is pretty good use of Photoshop, or these are twins, because it looks like it could be the same person in the blue dress that's in the black behind her. And if you look closely, they're very, very similar. Same eyeshadow and lipstick and hair. Her hair is pulled up on the right. But maybe, think about why I would put this picture there. Well, maybe the person who's at the ATM machine is realizing that they need X amount of dollars tonight. $300 because they have to pay somebody, or they need something really desperately or badly. Maybe they have a sick relative who they need to get medicine for, and they don't have enough money. And you may find yourself, if you ever experience these kind of things, thinking about how can I possibly come up with that kind of money. We will daydream of robbing a bank, and we'll play through the scenario like we might be able to get away with this, knowing it's not going to be possible. It's not something we could do. This is one reason movies are so interesting to us, because it's very easy. Like we talk about sensation and perception, the human brain can implant themselves right there in the screen and actually feel and understand what the characters are going through just like they were there themselves. This is a very good way for the brain to deal with the reality and try to search for and find potential solutions to problems that are really bothering us. That's why we daydream. That's why we dream, is what many people believe when we're even asleep. So, there are some who take the daydreaming a little bit too far, and I'll start in the top right-hand corner here and work my way around. But the poster I want to believe is from an old television show. Anybody? Anybody? This is from this show called X-Files. I've wanted to have this up next to my desk for a long time, and I never order it. I need to get it ordered someday. Excuse me. The poster was from, there's Mulder and Scully, the two people in it, David Duchovny and Gillian Anderson. The show was on TV for a long time. But he sort of searched after these X-Files or unexplained phenomenon. He had a fantasy-prone personality. Some of the things that were happening probably weren't really X-Files, but he was wanting to believe they were so badly that he kind of pushed himself in that direction. And of course, sometimes in the show they were X-File-ish. Stewie kills Lois. You probably have seen or heard of this show before, but the little baby there in the high chair is actually planning on killing his mother pretty much all the way through it. This is a take on Freud and how Freudian thought works, that there's this anger between the child and the mother. They get a little bit wrong because he'd be older before he'd start experiencing that, but the baby is always constantly plotting the death of his mother. This is a funny plot line. And as we move our way around here, the coyote in the middle, who has the help sign up, of course he's always plotting and fantasizing about how he can catch the Roadrunner, which I think he did once in one of the last episodes, but I don't really recall. That's one of my favorite ones from when I was a child. And of course, the world's best boss, who is not the world's best boss, Steve Carell from The Office. Not a show I watched a lot of, but he is someone who has quite a vivid imagination. So someone who imagines and recalls experiences with lifelike vividness, who spends considerable amount of time fantasizing, may have a fantasy-prone personality. This can be sometimes a person who has trouble dealing with reality so much that they kind of descend into a world of make-believe. Let's come back to the world of reality and look at the image on the screen here. It's a circular clock. And I know it's military time, so sorry about that. But noon, 12 o'clock at the high noon there, is where it's 12. And I'll use the arrow key here. As you move around this thing, midnight is at the bottom. So this gets kind of be confusing to some people, because what's it doing? It's counting around the dial. You've got the morning or high noon at the top. So where is nighttime? It's at the bottom. And where is like morning time? It's up there at the top of the clock. So don't look at this like it's a clock. It's more like a cycle. And this is your circadian rhythm. As you wake up, okay, and you are having the ability to your deepest sleep here is at like 2 o'clock in the morning. 4:30 a.m. lowest body temperature. Around 6 or 6:45 you have a sharp rise in blood pressure. The melatonin secretion that was helping you sleep stops. Bowel movements are likely. Probably more likely for me, or not. High testosterone secretion at 9 o'clock. Even for women, there is some testosterone secretion. Hormones are kicking in to help get you going. At 10 o'clock in the morning, you'd be at your highest alert situation. You get in the afternoon, and you start seeing where's your best coordination time. It's sometime around you know, the same time that you probably have practice after school, so right after school is over. There's your fastest reaction time, greatest cardiovascular efficiency, and then your blood pressure is at the highest in the evening. That's the highest body temperature as well. But then melatonin secretion starts again. Bowel movements will be suppressed because you don't like to do that when you go to sleep. And then you enter another sleep cycle. These are the biological rhythms. There are also other rhythms like the annual seasonal cycles. There are examples like bears hibernating and seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, which is sad. We'll look at that in a second. There's the 28-day menstrual cycle, which I'm not really going to get into, but you can ask women about that. 24-hour circadian rhythm, which we've been looking at here at the bottom, and the 90-minute sleep cycle, where we will go through sleep cycles about every 90 minutes. That's what we'll look at in the next presentation. So the influence of daylight on the well-being of the population. You can see it across the bottom there. The time period where we have the shortest duration of daylight is between January and February. In this time period, well-being is at the worst point for humans. We seem to crave sunshine and enjoy that state of sunshine. We're very lucky in Houston. You have no idea. Growing up in Pittsburgh in the wintertime, sometimes in some winters were so long and unbearable. My grandmother, every year, it got to be January, around Super Bowl time, and she was just highly exhausted, tired, crabby, was not happy. She had a bit of seasonal affective disorder, and you can see in May and June people are at their strongest. Now, I want to caution you that this is very interesting to me because I think in Houston it's a bit different. In Houston in May and June and July, it is so hot outside. All right, Griff. He's drinking. Crazy dog. I think it's so hot outside in the summertime here that we're not outside as much as we normally would be. But that still is not really going to impact our well-being as much. As long as you get a sense of the outside light. Whether you're going in the car someplace and you're popping the air conditioner on, or you're inside with windows next to you, you're not going to feel that same sense of things. Crazy dog. Let's look at the next part here. This is Washington State's weather. And you can see the different places here. Mount Baker, most snowfall in 12 months, 95 feet, world record in 99. The wettest annual average is in Forks, Washington, right there on the coast. The foggiest days of the year, 106 days of the year in fog at Cape Disappointment. Well, I guess that's why they call it Cape Disappointment. The warmest annual for Washington is 54.1 degrees. Most rain in 24-hour cycle is at Mount Mitchell, where they had 14.26 inches in 1986. The most snowfall up at Crystal Mountain in 24 hours. In 1994, they had a lot of snow then. It didn't have the total on there. I don't think it does it. Most consecutive dry days down at Swan Lake. So, White Swan. Sorry, not Swan Lake. Jeez, different thing. Sunnyside had the driest annual, 7.5 inches average you get the picture. Precipitation. So it's interesting how you can kind of look at the map here and see the different perspective that you get in this one state. Contrary to popular opinion, it says we're not just in a constant state of gray. When it comes to weather, the evergreen state goes to extremes, and it really does. This is something we're not very aware of down here. But it'd be like somebody who's visited Houston and they think it's just hot and humid everywhere in Texas, and it's not. If you go way out in the mountains or past Austin into the hill country, it's very different. But Washington does have a problem with seasonal affective disorder, where you're having the winter blues. You'll see there, and this is why I want to show this to you. Understanding how the chemical transfer happens here in your brain, where the hypothalamic neurons are releasing or are bringing in, dopamine or serotonin, somatostatin. These different chemical connections and this neurotransmitter switch that happens. It's very important in your body, but this is happening all the time and we don't always consider it. The woman at the top here has a light. It looks like it's just a big white, I don't know, sheet or screen or something there, but that's actually a light, and it's shining light on her face. This is one way people can beat the winter blues. SAD, or seasonal affective disorder, is diagnosed in the DSM-4 and 5, the newest version. It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This is what psychologists use to diagnose. We'll hear more about this at the end of the semester. Recurrent major depressive disorder that occurs at a specific time of year and fully remits otherwise, which means it only happens at a specific time of the year. Must meet 4 criteria. Depressive remissions, you have patterns of these things happening. You have a seasonal depressive episode that outnumber other depressive type episodes, and a prevalence in the U.S. ranging from 1.4% in Florida to 9.7% in New Hampshire, which is pretty high. The symptoms of SAD are difficulty waking up in the morning, morning sickness, overeating, probably because you're sad, especially craving for carbohydrates, which leads to weight gain. Other symptoms include a lack of energy, difficulty concentrating, completing tasks. So you could see how this borders on depression, but it is not permanent. So if you were to take antidepressive medication, I'm not sure that's the best thing for you because those have side effects. This is only seasonal. And so you get into the summer months and you may not be feeling these kinds of things at all, but you may be over-medicating yourself. Taking antidepressants, and this is something you need to discuss with a doctor, and certainly not me, but from what my little bit of knowledge tells me, taking antidepressants irregularly is not a good idea. So with SAD, they have lots of different ways to be able to treat it, but one of the biggest ways is a light. And I had a person that I met at the dog park who, she travels the country, she works for the government. She's in Texas now, but she had worked in Washington the 2 years before this, and she said she was super depressed her second year there. First year was fine. Second year, she was living in Seattle. She went to the doctor. She said, I think I'm going through terrible depression. I don't know what's wrong with me. And the doctor said, you're not from around here, are you? Here's what you need to do. And they took out a pen and they wrote a prescription for her to buy a certain type of light. And she said, this light will come on automatically in your bedroom in the morning. It'll fill the room with light, this special kind of light that simulates sunshine, and you should start to feel better. If you don't, we'll get you a face light, which is similar to what the lady has up there. And she said that, and some vitamin D3, really helped her through that, and she started to feel somewhat better. But she felt a lot better when she moved. Circadian rhythms, okay, are another one of these types of cycles, and they're the 24-hour biological processes that could be interrupted by exposure to light, like we mentioned, or not being able to be exposed by light. It resets your biological clock by affecting sometimes we call this the area that is, I'm trying to think exactly where it is. It's this little tiny area in your brain. The suprachiasmatic chiasmatic nucleus. I'm probably butchering that, but I'm having one of those days. And the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. But that area, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, I'm pronouncing it wrong, I know I am. It's just not coming to me. That area is really important with circadian rhythm. So if you have an area of the brain that is not functioning or communicating correctly with that area and with the pineal gland, and you're not creating enough melatonin and it's not being secreted enough into your system, you would have trouble sleeping. That's why some people take melatonin to sleep better. I know a teacher who had that problem. They were miserable all the time because they couldn't get enough sleep. And the doctor prescribed melatonin, and they have been a very reasonable person since then. Thank goodness for modern medicine. We have a 24-hour biological clock. Our body temperature and awareness changes throughout the day, and it is best to take a test or study during your peak circadian periods. 10 a.m. is typically a good time, but students have a different kind of circadian rhythm. Some of you are much better in the morning than you are in the afternoons, evenings, etc. How can the circadian rhythm help explain jet lag? Something I want you to think about here. Also notice at the top left-hand side the circadian rhythms of the body and the body. And different body functions rise and fall over the 24-hour period based on circadian rhythms. In the daytime in the morning, your body temperature, your cortisol hormone, and your blood pressure are rising. And at night, they're not. The melatonin, growth, testosterone, and other hormones are going down during the day and they're coming back up at night. This is a natural process. If any part of that is off, you may have trouble with sleep, with you may have worse jet lag because you're not sleeping well, and those kinds of things. Here's more information on the circadian rhythm, and you can pause this and look at it more deeply, but you see the melatonin being produced there and being sent into the bloodstream. And the rest of it, that SCN, which is what I should have just called it in the first place, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it again because I'll just butcher it one more time. But the SCN is really like your clock. So if you've ever taken a computer apart and there's that little tiny disk in there that kind of deals with the time, it keeps the time on a computer. Sometimes an older computer for sure will lose track of the time, and your clock is always wrong on your computer and you're like, what's going on here? That may need to be replaced. It's kind of like a clock battery from a watch. And that's the same thing in your body. That little tiny bean in there tells yourself when it is morning, noon, and night, and not just, hey, all of a sudden it's night, but the shifting happening, so you get these changes in serotonin levels and melatonin and others. Now, how is it noticing that? It's noticing it through the eyes, and you can see the connection there right behind the eyes and the light that's coming into it. So I think the top left corner here is really instrumental. It is easier to adjust when you're moving from New York to San Francisco than it will be if you're moving from San Francisco back to New York. The reason is that you're moving against the time zones from San Francisco to New York. You're moving with the time zones, and in a way, you're not losing as much sleep. If you think about it, if you leave at 10 p.m. and it takes you 3 hours to move across the country, basically what you're going to be looking at here is you're kind of catching up. The problem is, sooner or later, you're going to end up having to fly back, and that's when the jet lag especially hits people. Some people worse than others. There are little tips and things you can do to help, but there's not much that can be done other than just your body adjusting and regulating itself. Circadian is your 24-hour. Infradian is your longer than 1 day, which would be menstruation, breeding, tidal rhythms, seasonal rhythms. The ultradian are your repeated throughout the day multiple times kinds of things, which would be sleep cycle, the hormonal rhythms, and your hot and cold regulations, urinary, bowel movements, and much more predictable patterns. This is a fantastic video by Chuck Shawhorn again, on body rhythms. He does a really good job of pinpointing what's on the AP test here for you. It's an area I used to be pretty lax on and didn't cover as well. We've done a better job of it here in this video, but it's not a bad idea to check it again and to see his perspective on it. But this is the last thing on the slide and the slideshow, and it's basically looking at another way that we're impacted a little bit by the phases of the moon and the force of gravity because of the moon's relationship with the Earth. It has an impact on behavior. I think the full moon theory is probably a little overblown, but it does impact human behaviors, especially when you start looking at the cycle of things. So flipping back through this thing and coming back to the beginning here, the first part, consciousness, is what we've been dealing with. We're going to look at dreams and also sleep cycles as we go through this. So for the next time I see you, we'll look probably, I think, at sleep cycles and dreams, one or the other. We're also going to look at drugs and how do drugs affect and impact your consciousness. They are very exaggerated sensations of that. They can take you to points where you seem to be unconscious or asleep, or unable to be conscious of your environment, to having your heart race and speed up and being much more aware of your surroundings, or sedating you and going in the opposite direction. Also, there are hallucinogenics, which will give you this a conscious experience that doesn't even exist. I wouldn't recommend that, though. So for next time, we'll see if you've got any questions on this stuff. Don't be afraid to email me anytime and ask. We'll see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome.